Chapter 1. Bruce Banner sat straight up out of the nightmare, sweaty, his pulse racing. He reached over to the metronome he kept by his bed and put one hand on it, listening to its steady tick, tick, tick at 60 beats per minute. He tried to slow his pulse down to that rhythm. When he had gotten it under control, he stopped the device. He woke up like that nearly every day, keeping the metronome going all night to give his unconscious mind a rhythm. So far, he'd been able to keep himself from getting out of control for 5 months. That's how long it had been since the monster had gotten out. He'd been in Jacinho Favela, Brazil, for about that long, hiding out in the jumble of shacks and apartment buildings. It was where the poor people lived, and the people who wanted to disappear. Bruce was both. He made breakfast, then watched some TV with a Portuguese-English dictionary by his side. He was trying to learn the language, and making decent progress. His dog, who he called cachorro because it was the word for dog, sat at his side, begging. Bruce looked up a word. He asked cachorro if he was hungry in Portuguese. Cachorro's ears pricked up. Bruce gave him his plate to lick. After washing up, he headed for his daily Aikido practice. He'd never been a fighter, but Aikido was good for teaching self-discipline, and since the event back at Culver University, Bruce knew he needed all the self-discipline he could get. In the Aikido gym, his instructor ran him through exercises and drills, ending up with a series of falls that had Bruce breathing hard. He knew his pulse was up over 100 beats per minute. That wasn't dangerous territory, but it was a little too fast. His instructor waved at him to sit. Then he sat opposite Bruce, both of them cross-legged. "Let's work on your breathing," he said in Portuguese. Bruce nodded. "Here, emotions," his instructor said, placing a palm flat on his chest. He touched his belly and huffed out short breaths. His belly pushed in with each one. Bruce started doing it too. Together, they practiced breathing from the belly, using the diaphragm. "When you control your emotions, you control your body," his instructor said. "Now we'll control your pulse." He slapped Bruce in the face, hard. Bruce held himself back from responding, but he felt his pulse quicken. Slap! His face stung, and he felt the rage building. Bruce glanced down at his watch. His pulse was 146. Too high. He breathed. He did exactly what his instructor had showed, letting the breath flow deep into his belly and come back out. Slowly, his pulse came back down to a more normal rate. "You're learning," his instructor said. It was time to go to work at the bottling plant, making sure thousands of bottles of Guaraná soda got where they were supposed to go every day. The beans at the Brazilian Guaraná plant had 3 times as much caffeine as coffee. It definitely wasn't something Bruce was going to drink. Not when it was so important to keep his pulse down. He didn't even drink tea or eat chocolate anymore because they contained caffeine. He filed into the plant along with the other day laborers, finding a place in the dingy, poorly lit locker room between the main gate and the factory floor. As Bruce put his bag in his locker, someone banged into him hard from behind. He looked up and saw one of the factory's tough guys cruising on down the hall. Most of his co-workers were just regular people, but there were a few bullies in every crowd. If only the bully knew what Bruce could do to him. No. He shrugged it off and went to work. His job was basically to do a bunch of different jobs. He distributed the mail, loaded pallets of soda for shipping, and kept track of where everything was going. Today they were putting together a shipment headed to the United States, specifically the Milwaukee and Chicago areas. First on the agenda today was distributing the mail. Bruce brought things to a couple dozen people throughout the bottling plant, including a young woman named Martina, who was friendly to him and occasionally helped him with the language. She also lived 2 floors below him at the favela. The snap of an electrical short came from the catwalk up above the conveyor belts that snaked all over the factory floor, carrying bottles to be filled and capped. The upper level was where the managers watched and kept track of everything. They also stopped and started the different lines to make sure everything stayed coordinated. "Breakdown! Breakdown!" the owner called from up on the catwalk. He beckoned for Bruce, who had fixed many of the factory's outdated machines already during his time there. Bruce went up to the catwalk and saw that the control switch operating the main filling conveyor belt had shorted out. He put his glasses on to look at the wiring. After stripping the wires so they had better contact and winding them around the button anchors again, he tried it out. The conveyor belt kicked into motion. "Okay," Bruce said. "I can make it work for a while, but you need new—" He trailed off, not knowing the Portuguese word for resistors. "I need a new factory," the owner said. 5 months you've been helping me out like this. You're too smart for day labor. Let me put you on the payroll." Bruce smiled and shrugged as he put the cover back on the control switch. He glanced over at the manager again. And that's when he cut his thumb on a sharp edge. It wasn't a terrible cut, but it bled quickly. Droplets fell through the catwalk onto the moving conveyor belt below. "No, no, no! Shut that off!" Bruce shouted. "Turn it off!" He was already running, trying to track the exact spot where the blood had fallen. "Watch out!" he said as he pushed past one of his surprised co-workers. The manager stopped the conveyor belt, and Bruce ran along the line until he found the spot where the blood drops had fallen. He carefully wiped them up with a rag from his pocket, scrubbing hard until all the blood was gone. Then he closed the cut with a little tube of superglue he kept in the same pocket with the rag. It was his emergency cut kit, and he was never without it, because Bruce knew how dangerous his blood could be. "Okay," he sighed. The line started up again. That had been close, Bruce thought. He hoped he'd gotten all the blood. He then wrapped up the pallet of just-filled bottles for shipping. He put the address label on the shrink wrap and headed off for lunch. On his way, he saw the guy who had bumped into him in the locker room. Now he was giving Martina a hard time, cornering her and touching her face, telling her how pretty she was. His friends watched and made rude comments. Bruce hesitated. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he couldn't just stand there and let Martina get harassed. He took a few steps toward her. "Martina," he called out in Portuguese, "want to come have lunch with me?" "Get lost, gringo," the leader snapped at Bruce. Bruce kept his eyes on Martina. "How about it?" The group leader stuck his arm out in front of Bruce. "I said beat it," he growled. "You want a problem?" Bruce raised his hands. "No problem," he said. "Too late," the guy said. He shoved Bruce in the chest. His friends muscled in closer to Bruce on all sides. Bruce's pulse began to race. He glanced down at the pulse monitor on his wrist. It was climbing fast, past 100 beats per minute, heading for 120. "Okay, listen," he told them in his broken Portuguese. "Don't make me hungry. You wouldn't like me when I'm—" Bruce bit his lip, realizing he'd mixed up a word. "No, wait. That's not right." The leader looked puzzled for a moment. Then, thinking Bruce was mocking him, he shoved Bruce again, causing another spike in Bruce's pulse. Things might have really gone wrong, but the manager saw the ruckus and shouted down from the catwalk, "Get moving! Get out of here!" The bully and his friends pushed past, laughing like it was no big deal. But from the looks on their faces, Bruce knew he'd be a fool to be caught alone with them. As soon as they were gone, Martina let out a big sigh and thanked Bruce. He smiled at her, carefully controlling his breathing, and then went on to eat his lunch. Chapter 2. When the final whistle of the day sounded, Bruce headed outside and was excited to see the supply driver waiting for him. He was one of the guys who moonlighted doing unofficial delivery runs between the jungle and the city. A week or so before, Bruce had asked him to find a specific flower. He had it. Bruce ran over and paid him. Then he hurried home with the rare orchids, feeling a surge of optimism to balance out the stressful day. When Bruce got home, he showed the package to Cachorro. "See that?" he said excitedly. "That's our ticket out of here." Cachorro barked, picking up on Bruce's excitement. Bruce put the flowers down and set up his laptop and portable satellite uplink. He kept them hidden in the apartment, together with a newspaper clipping. On the paper was a grainy, printed-out photograph of a beautiful woman with refined features and long dark hair. The caption read, "Dr. Elizabeth Ross." Bruce sighed. Betty Ross had been his girlfriend as well as his lab partner in the experiment that had gone so wrong. He missed her desperately, but he would never let himself be in a position to hurt her again. She didn't know where he was now, and he was going to stay hidden until he solved his problem. It had been a long time since he'd seen Betty. She might not love him anymore after what had happened at Culver, but the thought of her was the only thing that kept Bruce going sometimes. He fired up the satellite feed and used an encrypted chat program to contact a person he knew only as Mr. Blue. Bruce had spent the past months trying to reach out to people who knew something about gamma radiation. Mr. Blue clearly did, and Bruce relied on his scientific advice. He was a skilled research scientist himself, but he had no lab, and no way to keep up on the latest findings in his area, at least not if he wanted to stay hidden and stay safe. G. Blue, are you there? B. Mr. Green? Good hearing from you, my mysterious friend. G. I've found it. B. At long last. It's a lovely little flower, isn't it? Bruce looked at the flower. It was pretty, but that's not why he cared about it. He returned to the monitor and his encrypted conversation. Mr. Blue had already logged off after leaving a final note. B. Be sure to try a high dose. Good luck. Smiley face. Bruce signed off and got to work. First, he clipped the orchid's petals into small pieces. He gathered them in a small bowl and poured a bit of rubbing alcohol in before crushing the flour into a paste. He added more fluid and put the mixture into a makeshift centrifuge he'd built using parts from a bicycle. It spun most of the fluid out into a small vial, where Bruce examined it. It was still too cloudy, meaning there were still too many bits of the crushed petals. He needed a better filter. He lit his stove and slowly heated the mixture in a distilling setup, watching the purer fluid fall drop by drop into a new vial. Now it was clear. Now he could use it. After pricking his finger, Bruce squeezed a drop of his blood onto a glass slide. He peered down at the slide through a microscope and adjusted the focus until he could see individual little disc-shaped red blood cells. Only his weren't smooth and red. They were lumpy and a mixture of red and green, like they had been since his accident. This was the effect of the gamma radiation he'd been exposed to during the experiment. It was also what caused his transformation into that thing. Bruce took out the slide. He filled an eyedropper with the clear fluid he'd distilled from the crushed orchid petals. Then he squeezed out 3 drops onto his blood on the slide and stuck the slide back under the microscope. Peering into the eyepiece, Bruce saw the formula seeping into his blood from the edges. The green lumps disappeared, and what were left were ordinary cells. Bruce's heart jumped. Could he have found a cure? Could he finally come out of hiding and go home? Could he see Betty again? But as he kept watching, scribbling in a lab notebook to record the experiment, his cells deformed again, with the warty green bumps coming back and spreading to how they had been before. The experiment was a failure, and Bruce felt sick with the loss of hope. Eventually, Bruce got up from the lab table and went to his laptop to tell Mr. Blue the disappointing results. G. Another failure. B. How much did you use? G. All of it. B. Then it's time to meet. G. Not safe. B. Living with gamma poisoning is not safe. Stop messing with flowers. Send me a sample. B. Can't help if you won't let me. Bruce looked at the picture of Betty and at the litter of flower stems on his table. Mr. Blue was right. He'd done everything he could do without actually giving someone else a look at a sample of his blood. When you only had one option, there was no point wasting time. Bruce drew a few milliliters of his blood with a syringe, capped the tube, and wrapped it carefully for shipping. He labeled it Mr. Green. The next day, he mailed a package to Mr. Blue's post office box in New York City. Chapter 3. In his Pentagon office, General Thaddeus Ross, known to friends and enemies alike as Thunderbolt, snapped out of his reverie when his assistant, Major Kathleen Spar, put a stack of forms onto his desk. Ross signed the forms automatically. They were basic requisition orders, dull and routine. "Here's something a bit more interesting," Spar said. She held out a fax. "Possible gamma sickness. Milwaukee. A man drank one of those Guaraná sodas. Guess it had a little more kick than he was looking for." "Where was the soda bottled?" Ross asked. Major Spar checked the fax. "Jacinho Favela, Brazil." A few weeks before, intelligence had flagged something else in Jacinho Favela. A smuggler had been asking around about a particular rare orchid. It was known to SHIELD scientists to have anti-radiation sickness possibilities. Ross and Spar had tried to find out who had ordered the flower and where, but the Brazilian wilderness was a hard place to get good intelligence, and the lead had petered out. Now, though, a bottle of soda from the same city had turned up tainted with gamma radiation. That couldn't possibly be a coincidence. "Get our agency people looking for an American at that bottling plant," Ross ordered. "Tell them no contact. If he even sees them, he's gone." Then he got on the phone to call in some favors from an old friend. 2 hours later, a transport van stopped near the runway of Fort Johnson, deep in the Florida Everglades. Ross watched with his fellow general, Joe Greller. "I got you what I could," Greller said. "Short notice, but they're all quality. And I pulled you an ace." The chatter stopped as a helicopter banked in for a landing. Before the chopper was fully at rest, a short, muscular soldier with dirty blonde hair leaped out. There was nothing remarkable about his features, except his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who saw everything just a little bit better than most. "Emil Blonsky," Greller said. "Born in Russia, raised in England. On loan to SOCOM from the Royal Marines." SOCOM was the United States Special Operations Command. "I know you cashed in some chips for this, Joe," Ross said. Greller shrugged. "Glad I could help. Just make it good." As the plane buzzed toward Brazil, Major Spar handed out briefing folders containing photos of Bruce Banner, Bruce's apartment building, and the town of Jacinho Favela. The commandos studied them. "This is the target and the location," Spar lectured. "Snatch and grab only. Live capture. You'll have dart clips and suppression ordnance, but live fire is for backup only. We've got local help, but we want it tight and quiet." Ross joined the briefing in the rear of the plane. Blonsky looked up at him. "Is he a fighter?" Blonsky asked. "Your target is a fugitive from the U.S. government who stole military secrets," Ross replied curtly. He's also implicated in the deaths of 2 scientists, a military officer, an Idaho state trooper, and possibly 2 Canadian hunters. So don't wait to see if he's a fighter. Trank him and bring him back." Blonsky nodded. Chapter 4. That night, Bruce was relaxing, trying to stay cool, when a chime sounded from his laptop. Mr. Blue was contacting him over the encrypted channel. Bruce hopped out of bed and hurried to the table. B. Good news. Preliminary blood tests show significant gamma reduction. Hardly daring to believe it, Bruce typed, G. Will it cure me? B. Yes. B. But I need more data. Oh, come on, Bruce said. Mr. Blue was still typing. B. Exposure levels, gamma concentration, cell saturation. G. Impossible. Data is not here. B. Where is it? G. Home. Frustrated, Bruce closed the laptop and sat for a long while, looking at the picture of Betty. Again, just when it looked like he might be making some progress, he was cut off. He'd almost allowed himself to hope that he'd be able to find the cure himself, and then he'd be able to go home. Maybe he and Betty could have picked up where they'd left off before the accident. But no. Now it didn't look like that would be possible at all. Chapter 5. As Bruce slept, Cachorro stretched against his feet. The night sounds of the city, car horns, a distant siren, a radio playing a samba reggae mix, echoed softly in the apartment. Somewhere down the hill, a dog barked. It was an ordinary evening in Jacinho Favela, except for the commando operation just now swinging into action. At the base of one of the alleys that wound up the steep hillside, a commando scanned the area with night vision goggles. Between 2 tenement buildings, he saw a narrow walkway that rose at a sharp angle toward the target location. Laundry flapped on clotheslines. The commando signaled to the other soldiers. 5 figures stepped out of the shadows, and the squad moved up the alley in formation, their black uniforms making them seem like shadows themselves. They carried dart rifles and had backup MP5 submachine guns slung over their shoulders. The few people still out at this hour saw them and steered clear, not wanting any trouble. Ahead of them, at the top of a short flight of stairs, a dog stood barking. In Bruce's apartment, the sound of the dog barking stopped. Cachorro looked up and growled. The commandos climbed the stairs and continued up the alley, stepping over the tranquilized dog. Guided by handheld Geiger counters, they zeroed in on the target, a 4-story tenement built into the hillside near the top of the ridge. At the base of the hill, General Ross, Major Spar, and a Brazilian officer supervised the commandos' progress from the command vehicle, which was filled with surveillance equipment. Ross monitored the gamma radiation levels on the feeds from the Geiger counters. They ticked up sharply as the commando team approached the target structure. "Gentlemen," he said, "here we go." When the soldiers reached Bruce's apartment building, Blonsky hand-signaled for one of them to head for the roof, using an interior stairwell since the building had no fire escape. Blonsky then motioned for 2 of the commandos to approach the target's door. Geiger counters ticked softly. One soldier dropped into a crouch and snaked a miniature video camera attached to a thin, flexible rod under the door. The soldier couldn't see any movement on the tiny monitor. He adjusted his device and was startled by the sight of a giant dog's muzzle sniffing the camera. A tongue blotted out his view as the dog licked the lens. Then it backed away, and he could see again. The target appeared to be asleep in his bed. The soldier with the camera held up one finger and then pointed it to the right, signaling that one person inside was low to the ground. Another soldier applied small blobs of plastic explosive to the hinges and lock. Blonsky stepped back and faced the door, his tranquilizer gun ready. He keyed a code into his microphone communicator. When Spar received Blonsky's signal, she turned her attention to the monitors, which showed feeds from one of the team's helmet cameras, one from the back of the building, and one from the soldier on the roof. Everything was in place. Ross nodded. "Take him," he ordered Blonsky. Boom! The explosives ignited, blowing the door off its hinges. Before the door had hit the floor, Blonsky hustled into Bruce's apartment, with the other commandos right behind him, sweeping the apartment for hostiles. The target's dog barked furiously as Blonsky cleared the doorway, stepped to his right, and fired 3 tranq darts at the sleeping form. Each dart hit its target, 1 dart in the torso and 1 in each of his legs. The target didn't move. That was unusual. The tranquilizer worked fast, but it wasn't instantaneous. Suspicious, Blonsky slowly approached the bed. He yanked the covers back. On the pillow was a styrofoam head covered with a wig and a baseball cap. Blonsky ripped the covers all the way off, revealing bunched-up pillows on the bed. The target's dog was still barking, and Blonsky, irritated, silenced it with a tranq dart. Then he saw the rope dangling out the window over the kitchen sink. Blonsky activated his microphone. "Targets on the move," he reported. Chapter 6. With his backpack over his shoulders, Bruce lowered himself from his kitchen window, down the outside of the building. His time in the gym had paid off. Before the event, he wouldn't have had the strength to do this. As he descended, the door right below him opened, and Martina looked out, drawn by the commotion upstairs. She gasped when she saw Bruce. He shushed her, and she let him in, shutting the door behind him. Bruce heard Cachorro stop barking up in his apartment. He hoped the commandos hadn't heard him. He also heard what they were saying to each other. "Target's on the move," one of them had reported, and then a moment later, "He's on the ground." Footsteps thumped above as the commandos searched Bruce's apartment and headed out in pursuit, assuming Bruce was on the run. He waited in Martina's apartment, crouching by the door until they were gone into the maze-like alleys of the favela. Below, on the street, he heard someone gunning a powerful engine, probably a military support vehicle. This had to be an American operation, even though at least one of the voices coming from upstairs had sounded British. When it had been quiet for a minute, Bruce nodded at Martina, and she nervously opened her front door and glanced outside. She shook her head. Nothing out there. With no time even to thank her, Bruce fled the apartment and hustled at a controlled walk down the street with the hood of his sweatshirt over his head. He took an indirect route down to the street, using the confusing alleys to his advantage. Along the way, he caught a glimpse of the black van and the black-clad commando guarding it. Unfortunately, the commando saw him, too. Bruce froze, just for a moment, but the suspicious reaction was all the commando needed. He started calling to the rest of his team. Bruce broke into a sprint, turning down the street. His heart rate was rising, inching up past 80 beats per minute. He had to stay calm. Otherwise, the monster would get out, and everyone could be in danger. Behind him, the commandos were in hot pursuit. Bruce doubled back away from the main street again and worked his way downhill, ducking under hanging laundry, leaping over baskets, careening across courtyards. Blonsky and his partner followed close behind, anticipating Bruce's turns through the labyrinth of alleys. When Bruce reached a paved street with fewer people, he bolted at full speed. He had to stop short when his path ended at a steep hillside with a sheer drop to the houses below. Bruce jumped onto the nearest roof and, jumping from one to the next, ran across the tops of the squat buildings. His feet pounded on the rusty tin, and shouts of complaint bellowed up from the occupants inside. Blonsky and his partner reached the hillside a few seconds later, in time to see Bruce jumping from house to house. Blonsky scanned the area, looking for a faster way down. 2 other commandos had a different line of pursuit. They were right on the target's tail. Meanwhile, the black van circled around the slum at top speed to catch Bruce if he came out the other side. Ross and Spar stayed glued to their video monitors, watching the chaotic green-lit images of the chase. Bruce reached an area thick with laundry, and the flapping sheets almost obscured the edge of a roof. He whipped through the cloth, his hood slipping back as he jumped down to another level of roofs. The 2 commandos following him hit the same patch of clotheslines, but the taller soldier missed the blind jump. He fell hard, rolled to a standing position, and headed downhill, knowing the target had to come out on the main street sooner or later. Bruce reached the end of the residential area and hopped down from the last roof into a party area of bars and late-night clubs. The streets here were crowded with people out for a good time. It would be easier to disappear. But he had to stop. His pulse was hammering, up toward 170, and that was monster territory. Pressing himself into a rack of empty bottles at the back of a restaurant, Bruce worked himself through a quick set of mental exercises. He knew he didn't have much time. As soon as he got it down toward 150, he looked out, only to see one of the commandos. The commando raised his gun and fired. Bruce heard the dart go by, too slow to be a bullet. They were trying to tranquilize him. He launched himself into the midst of the crowd, turned right, getting a step on the pursuing commandos again. Blonsky charged after Bruce, but the crowds on the narrow sidewalk slowed him down. The operation was no longer quiet, but it could still be successful. He lost visual contact and shoved through the crowds, looking for a sign of where the target might have gone. Bruce checked his pulse monitor. 160. 165. He was in trouble. His pulse was too high, and he was really sweating now. He veered into an alley, rushed around a corner, and popped out onto a side street, almost running into the black van's open door. Seated inside was General Thunderbolt Ross. Ross looked up, and for a dizzying second, he locked eyes with Bruce. It was the first time they'd seen each other in 5 years. Bruce broke into motion just as fast as he stopped and launched into another alley. Ross. He should have known. Bruce reeled through the narrow street, breathing hard. When the alley ended, he took a hard right down a busy, wide street filled with restaurants. Bruce glanced back to see if anyone was following him, and he slammed right into a group of 4 men. Bruce recognized them as the tough guys from the bottling plant, led by the one who'd been harassing Martina, and he could tell from the looks on their faces that they recognized him, too. His stomach sank. The guys were rowdy and looking for a fight, and for them, no one better than Bruce could have shown up at that exact moment. The problem was, Bruce couldn't afford to fight. He couldn't spare the time, or Ross's commandos would catch him, and he couldn't take the stress, or the monster would get out. The leader of the group stepped up and threw a wild punch at Bruce, who saw it coming a mile away. His Aikido training kicked in. He caught the guy's sleeve and used his own momentum to send him crashing into a pile of trash. Before the man's friends could react, Bruce ran, skidding into another side alley. Behind him, he could hear pursuit. Now he had commandos and local dirtbags chasing him. Great. At the end of the alleyway, Bruce found himself outside the bottling factory. With little time to think, he raced toward it. At the same time, the commandos had narrowed their pursuit. They knew the target couldn't be far. General Ross had just seen him, and from the van's location there was only one way the target could have gone without one of the team spotting him. Blonsky climbed back onto a low-hanging roof and surveyed the town. He spotted a group of locals slipping through the loosely chained back gate of a small factory. They were chasing someone, and Blonsky had a feeling he knew who. "Where is he?" General Ross demanded over the comlink. "Targets acquired," Blonsky reported. Chapter 7. In the factory changing room, Bruce heaved deep breaths, his back against the wall. He listened to the drip of the showers as he tried to lower his pulse rate, slowly easing it down from a very dangerous 187 toward a safer 100 beats per minute. A noise on the factory floor startled him, and his pulse jumped again. It was the tough guys. He couldn't stay in the locker room, waiting to be found. He crept out amid the machinery, pausing every few seconds to listen for footsteps. He could hear the men whispering, drunkenly following him. Their leader would want Bruce's head on a stick for interfering with his pursuit of Martina, and for the embarrassment of having the manager yell at them like school children. If a fight became inevitable, so would... No monster today. Bruce threaded through the banks of bottling machines, getting closer to the far side of the factory, where he could see an exit sign dimly glowing green. Under it was a steel door. He pushed gently on the latch and escaped. The leader was waiting for him. He laughed and shoved Bruce back into the factory. Bruce stumbled backward and then turned to run, but the other tough guys were standing behind him. They gathered around Bruce and began to shove and kick him against the machines. Bruce caught one of them with an elbow and got free for a moment, but the others pinned him against the wall. "Please," Bruce begged, "don't do this." His pulse hit 140 beats per minute. The leader pulled off Bruce's backpack and slapped his face. "What?" the leader sneered. He flung the backpack away. "No, not the computer," Bruce said. He was still gasping for breath, and his pulse was starting to get out of his control. "Not so tough now, huh? Try those fancy moves again. Come on, we all want to see." He gave Bruce a hard push, and Bruce fell back onto a knobby piece of equipment, crying out in agony. The commandos raced into the factory and heard the confrontation. Blonsky signaled for his men to split up, and he slid on his night vision goggles. He could see the heat signatures of a cluster of men glowing neon green in the darkness. The four guys continued to bully Bruce, with two of them pinning him against a labeling machine. "Please stop," cried Bruce. His pulse climbed to 150 beats per minute. "Me, angry, very bad," he said in Portuguese. "You bad angry?" the leader replied. "I bad angry." Behind him, Bruce spotted a quick motion in the shadows. A black-clad figure crouched in the dim light. Panic flooded his body, and Bruce's pulse shot up to 175, climbing rapidly to 190, then higher. "You don't understand," he yelled. "Something really bad is going to happen here." "Yeah," the leader agreed. "Something bad is going to happen." A commando's night vision scope alighted on Bruce's face, then dropped its sight on his neck. Bruce saw a gleaming tranquilizer gun's muzzle peeking out from the shadows. He lunged to the side, pulling the tough guys with him. The leader punched Bruce in the gut, and Bruce crumpled. Blonsky fired the tranq gun, missing Bruce but nailing one of the other men in the neck. Bruce gasped as his pulse leaped past 200, his heart throbbing. Blonsky peered through his night vision goggles at the cluster of green men. One of the shapes dropped where the tranq had hit him, and another was already huddled on the floor. "Maybe Banner is a fighter after all," he thought. Then a strange blast of green light flared. All the commandos' Geiger counters spiked. In the van, Ross saw the radiation spike and bolted forward in his chair. Blonsky ripped off his night vision goggles, then signaled for the other commandos to hold position. He watched as the tough guys, the two who were still upright, nervously backed away. Blonsky couldn't clearly see what was happening, but it looked like Bruce was being twisted into strange shapes. Then Bruce let out an anguished scream, and a strange tearing sound filled the factory. "Anybody else seeing this?" asked one of the other commandos. All of them were. Where Bruce had been lying on the ground, groaning in pain, now there was something else. "Shut up!" the leader hissed, and he launched a kick at Bruce's warping body. That was the worst mistake of his life. His foot met something insanely hard. Almost too fast to see, the leader was launched upward by his leg across the expanse of the factory. He crashed through an office window and hit the wall hard enough to leave a dent in the sheet metal. The sounds were nearly drowned out by an inhuman howl from the creature in the shadows. When the roar faded, everyone in the factory fell silent. Then, yelling, the remaining bully bolted from the shadows. An enormous muscular arm reached out after him. He was dragged screaming into the darkness, and a moment later, his body was flung back out into the open, sprawled on the factory floor. "We've got a bogey of some kind," one of the commandos said. "Please advise." "That is the target," Ross roared. "Use every trank you've got. Do it now!" Two of the soldiers advanced toward where the giant lurked between enormous liquid tanks. They rapidly fired their tranquilizer darts into the darkness. The projectiles fell to the concrete floor, their needles bent as if they'd hit a wall. A massive foot stepped out of the shadows and crushed the darts. The beast charged, heaving the bottling tanks out of the way with unbelievable strength. The creature then stomped toward the commandos. Soldiers whipped out their submachine guns. "Go live!" one screeched. Bottles exploded around the factory, and the bullets ricocheted off the roof. The commandos pulled together into a tight formation, moving through the factory and searching for their target. Blonsky and his partner ducked behind a bank of machinery. The body of one commando landed nearby, hitting an on switch. The machinery roared to life, trundling broken bottles down the belt with loud clanks and bright blinking lights. Between another set of vast tanks, Blonsky saw that the creature was on the move. His partner opened fire, but the tanks prevented a clear shot. Blonsky spotted a set of stairs to the catwalks above. He raced for it while his partner backed up two other commandos firing at the creature. They could see they were hitting it, but the bullets were bouncing off, ricocheting into machinery and pinging to the ground. The creature didn't even slow down. Up on the catwalk, Blonsky peered down as the creature disappeared into a cloud of steam in an open middle area. His partner pulled an anti-personnel grenade off his belt and hurled it into the steam. The soldiers ducked for cover. The grenade hit something and detonated, rocking the factory. The beast's massive form was outlined by the explosion, but then steam covered him again. The soldiers waited. No way anyone was walking away from that, Blonsky thought. Then the pounding of heavy feet shook the floor. A roar and sickening sound of tearing steel echoed through the room. Out of the steam, a gargantuan metal tank lurched forward like a gigantic sled pushed by the giant. It clipped the supports of the catwalk under Blonsky and smashed into the soldiers on the ground. The commandos screamed as they got caught in the heaving machinery. It smashed into the far wall of the factory, rupturing in a fountain of green Guaraná soda. In the van, the soldiers' cameras blinked off, the monitors turning black. All Spar and Ross could hear over the microphones was moaning. Inside the factory, Blonsky sprinted along the catwalk above the creature, looking for a clean shot. He got one when he reached the corner. His bullets raked across the beast's shoulder blades. He was humanoid, but the size of 3 men, 4 maybe, and green. His skin looked like it was stretched to the limit over unbelievable masses of muscle. Enraged, the creature spun around, swatting the bullets out of the air with his giant hands. Blonsky reloaded his weapon, his eyes remaining locked on his target. But then he froze in awe as the beast stepped out fully from the shadows. The creature glared up at him with rage, then snarled and flexed his shoulders, grabbing a forklift and hurling it easily up at Blonsky like he was throwing a baseball. Blonsky dove to the side as the machinery crashed into the catwalk where he'd just been standing. The catwalk lurched, and Blonsky hung on desperately. The creature grabbed a steel block of machinery off the assembly line and hurled it. This projectile wasn't aimed at Blonsky. With an ear-splitting crash, it smashed a gaping hole through the wall of the factory. "No!" General Ross shouted. He was not going to come this close and then miss Bruce. He pulled the van's door open and dashed outside. "Sir, no!" Spar shouted. Ross had just reached the side of the bottling plant when the wall exploded in front of him. He ducked around a corner for cover, then peered around the edge. The giant stepped out of the hole, his eyes glinting as he looked around. Then he took off running. Ross watched, his chest heaving, as the beast barreled away into the night. Chapter 8. After the factory, Ross's team searched Bruce's apartment. A forensics technician inspected Bruce's homemade lab, while Spar riffled through his belongings. The stuff in the bottles were basic lab chemicals, Spar reported to Ross. He was cooking something, but there's no trace of it. He zeroed the place. Not a scrap of paper. Like he knew we were coming. "He didn't know," Ross replied. "He's just always ready to leave." Then Blonsky entered the apartment, carrying Bruce's backpack. "I knew something was different before I shot the first trank," he said. "He had it on him when he bolted." "Tell me that's what I'm hoping it is," Spar said. She took the backpack and emptied it, pulling out a laptop. A grainy printout of a picture fell out, and Blonsky picked it up. "Is that a girlfriend?" Blonsky wondered, examining the photo of Betty Ross. "She helps him, maybe?" General Ross snatched the picture of his daughter out of Blonsky's hands. "She is no longer a factor," he said. "We closed that door to him long ago. He's alone. He wants to be alone." He tapped the laptop. "But see if he's been talking to anybody." Blonsky stepped between Ross and Spar. "Forgive me, sir," he said, "but does somebody want to talk about what went down in there? Because he didn't lose us, and he wasn't alone. We had him, and something hit us. Something big." Getting frustrated when Ross didn't respond, Blonsky raised his voice. "It threw a forklift." Calming himself, he added, "It was the most powerful thing I've ever seen." "Well, it's gone," Ross said. "If Banner knows what it is," Blonsky swore, "I'm going to track him down, and I'm going to put my foot on his throat, and—" Ross cleared his throat. "That was Banner." Blonsky shifted nervously. "You're going to have to explain that statement, sir." "No, I don't," Ross replied. "You've done a good job. Pack up and get our men on the plane. We're going home." Then he strode out of Bruce's apartment. Spar and Blonsky started after the general, dumbstruck. Bruce woke to birdsong in the forest. He'd fallen asleep on a rock at the base of a waterfall. Well, sleep wasn't really the right word. Somehow the creature had run out of rage or energy here. Then it had just stopped, and Bruce had become himself again. He looked at his hands, his pale and ordinary hands. His only clothing was a shredded pair of pants. He had to hold them up as he walked. Groaning, he followed a muddy road out of the woods until he reached a paved highway cutting through the mountains. Bruce waved down a truck and leaned in the passenger side window. "Can you help me?" he asked the driver in Portuguese. "No habla portugués," the driver replied. "Spanish?" People in Brazil didn't speak Spanish, which meant, Bruce realized, that he was no longer in Brazil. But, "Donde estoy?" Bruce asked. "Where am I?" "Guatemala," the driver said. Guatemala? That was all the way north across Central America from Brazil. Somehow, Bruce had traveled more than 3,000 miles while the monster had been loose. "I'm going to the next town," the driver added in Spanish. He didn't ask what Bruce was doing in the middle of the rainforest, dressed only in a pair of pants that barely stayed up. "Will you help me?" Bruce asked. The driver leaned across and opened the door. "Get in." When Bruce was in the truck, the driver gave him a blanket and helped Bruce wrap it around his shoulders. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Home," Bruce said. The driver nodded and drove on, not asking any more questions. Bruce was grateful for this simple act of kindness. Bruce got across the border from Guatemala into Mexico and slumped exhausted in the main market of a small town in Chiapas. He had to rest. A boy put a few coins into his hand, thinking he was a beggar. The coins didn't amount to much, but they were enough that he could get a shirt and a pair of pants at a nearby stall. The vendor gave him things in his size, but Bruce looked at the pants, thinking about what he would do if the hulking monster came back. He'd need something. "Tienes más stretchy?" he asked, and the vendor smiled at his bad Spanish. But she found him a large, stretchy pair of pants. They were comically big on him, but they might hold together during a transformation. Dressed again, Bruce felt better. He got something to eat, and then he kept going. Blonsky walked with General Ross back into the command center at the Everglades base. "I've run into bad situations on crap missions before," he said. "I've seen good men go down purely because someone didn't let us know what we were walking into. I've moved on to the next one because that's what we do, right? I mean, that's the job. But this?" He stopped walking, and General Ross did too. "This is a whole new level of weird," Blonsky said. "I don't feel inclined to step away from it. So if you're taking another crack at him, I want in." He wanted to get back at Bruce for what had happened in the factory, but Blonsky also wanted more. He'd seen the creature's unthinkable power, and he wanted that, too. "And with respect," he went on, "you should be looking for a team that's prepped and ready to fight. Because if that thing shows up again, you're going to have a lot of professional tough guys running for their mamas." Blonsky could see Ross thinking, but all Ross did was dismiss him. It wasn't until a few days later that Ross called him in, and Blonsky got a whole new understanding of what they were up against. "Let me emphasize that what I'm about to share with you is tremendously sensitive, both to me personally and to the Army," Ross said as he and Blonsky walked through a hangar. It was filled with helicopters and armored vehicles. "You're aware that we've got an infantry weapons development program. Well, in World War II, they initiated a sub-program for biotech force enhancement." "Yeah, the Super Soldier program," Blonsky said. He'd heard of it. "Yes," Ross said. "An oversimplification, but yes. And I dusted it off, got them doing serious work again. Bold work. Across the hall, they were trying to arm you better. We were trying to make you better." Banner's work was very early phase. It wasn't even weapons application. He thought he was working on radiation resistance. Ross smirked. I would never have told him what the project really was. But he was so sure of what he was on to that he tested it on himself. And something went very wrong. His smirk changed to a real smile, the kind of smile someone got when they had a secret. Or it went very right. Ross started to get down to business now that he'd begun to let Blonsky in on the secrets of the Super Soldier project. "As far as I'm concerned, that man's whole body is the property of the U.S. Army." "You said he wasn't working on weapons, right?" Blonsky asked. "No." "But you were, weren't you? You were trying other things." Ross saw that Blonsky was starting to put two and two together. Good, he thought. Blonsky might be just what he was looking for. "One serum we developed," he said, "was very promising." "So why did he run?" Blonsky asked. Ross stood. "He's a scientist. He is not one of us. Blonsky, how old are you?" 45? Blonsky bristled but tried not to show it. 39, he said. It takes a toll, doesn't it? Yes, it does. So get out of the trenches. You should be a colonel by now with your record. No, I'm a fighter, Blonsky said. I'll be one for as long as I can. You know, if I could take what I know now and put it in the body I had 10 years ago, that would be someone I wouldn't want to fight. Perfect, General Ross thought. He wants it. I could probably arrange something like that, he said. Recruiting was easy when you identified the right man for the job, he thought.